BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday. On Wednesdays this year I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved murder mystery. And in this episode I will be responding to one of the most famous psychological profiles that has ever been created about Jack the Ripper. And this one comes to us from John Douglas, who created this for the FBI in 1988. And I read about Jack the Ripper a lot on the internet, and there was a site that stood out to me, and it was Texas State University. And Texas State University in the United States decided to share the psychological profile created by John Douglas as a resource. And I would like to provide the most basic introduction to the source material. No one knows who Jack the Ripper was. No one knows for certain what motivated him. But he was, in a macabre way, a man of his times. The turmoil of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain upset the standard social order, generating new ambitions, conflicts, and frustrations. So immediately, I see what they're trying to do, but this is not John Douglas, mind you. This is a writer for Texas State University. But Jack the Ripper was a man of his times. I don't really like that phrasing, but just my take on the subject. Harsh and inhumane conditions, and indifference toward children, and a savage lifestyle all conspired to create an environment conducive to violence, sexual deviance, and others. It is not surprising that the psychological and social infrastructures of the 19th century gave us the first modern serial killer. And I mean, that really depends on what you mean by the first modern serial killer. There definitely were serial killers that operated before 1888. There's even one that happened rather close to Texas State University, and that was the Midnight Assassin, who operated in 1884 to 1885, and some people even believe that the Midnight Assassin and Jack the Ripper were one and the same. So, I would like to go right to the summary that has been provided by Texas State about the murders that have been attributed to Jack the Ripper. Little is known about Jack the Ripper beyond his handiwork. The first canonical murder took place on a bank holiday, Friday, August 31st of 1888 in Bucks Row. The victim was Polly Nichols, age 42, an alcoholic with gray hair and 5 missing teeth. She had 5 children and a broken marriage. The Ripper cut her throat from ear to ear, back to vertebrae, and sliced her open. The next killing took place at 29 Hanbury Street on September 8th of 1888. Annie Chapman was 45 years of age, and she was missing 2 of her front teeth as well, also an alcoholic. On Sunday, September 30th of 1888, a double murder occurred. The Ripper first attacked Elizabeth Stride in a courtyard next to the International Working Men's Educational Club on Berner Street. Stride was a 45-year-old alcoholic, also with missing front teeth, and the roof of her mouth was damaged. She bore 9 children, but claimed her husband and 2 offspring had perished in a steamboat disaster. The Ripper had cut her throat, severing her windpipe. The mutilation was minimal, as he was interrupted by a carriage entering the courtyard. Within the hour, a second body was discovered in Mitre Square, and it was that of Catherine Eddowes, age 43 years old. The final and most horrific murder occurred in 13 Miller's Court on Friday, November 9th of 1888, and it was Mary Kelly. She was the youngest. She was in her 20s, but already a widow, and had alcohol problems. In 1988, the FBI prepared a criminal personality profile for Jack the Ripper. John Douglas, as well as his partner Earl Shaker, created one as well in 1995 with amendments, and they shared it in a composition called The Secret Identity of Jack the Ripper. After an analysis of the crime scene, police and autopsy reports, photographs and victimology and area demographics, the following key crime scene elements were identified and discussed in the psychological profile created by John Douglas. And I'll read that for you guys right now. This is when it deviates from the whole concept of just providing some text from the writer. And these are the ideas for Jack the Ripper. Who was Jack the Ripper, and how does the psychological profiler John Douglas think the Ripper would have been like? The Ripper committed blitz attacks and lust murders. He had a high degree of psychopathology that he exhibited at crime scenes. No evidence of sexual assault, possible manual strangulation, post-mortem mutilation and organ removal, but no torture, elaboration of ritual. Victims selected on the basis of accessibility. All the crimes took place on a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday in the early a.m. hours. Unreported attacks might have occurred. Okay, though. First one here. about blitz attacks and lust murders, I've read this stuff a lot, where people think that the Ripper might not have had any real conversations with a lot of the victims. Not like the type of serial killer that walks over and pretends to be very charming. Maybe you'll remember the stories of Ted Bundy walking with the cast on his arm, and he's saying something to the effect of, "Oh, I need something from my boat, but my arm's broken, can you help me?" Not a ruse killer, what the psychological profiler Pat Brown would call a bop and drop killer, as terrible as that sounds. But someone who's committing the murder without putting on a ruse. I agree with that one. Possible manual strangulation. Now, as you heard about the victims in that little introductory statement, yes, they were strangled, and I've always thought the Ripper manually strangled the victims. I didn't see anything about how there was some type of evidence that would suggest something to the contrary, like they had ligature marks from a rope around their necks or something. Or, I also remember another story, that of Thug Ram and the Thuggee cult from India, and he would strangle men with a handkerchief that had a coin sewn into it. And again, I think that would just leave a very specific type of marking. If anything that was going on other than manual strangulation would take place, I think that there would be stronger evidence. The victims were selected on the basis of accessibility. Alright, so I want to continue with this because, as you guys know, I run this true crime channel, and I watch a lot of true crime videos. And I was watching a documentary about the serial killer Joseph Paul Franklin, who's referred to as the racist killer, and he was interviewed by a psychological profiler as well, also for the FBI, and what she said was, the victims were the last thing on his mind. They were the last component to his serial killer operations. He had an agenda. He wanted to commit murder, but he didn't necessarily care who the victims were. And of course, I thought about Jack the Ripper as well. It's possible that there were certain victims that the Ripper knew personally, but I think that requires a lot of speculation and theorization. Only looking at the facts, it appears that there aren't a lot of connections between or among the victims and all connected to a single suspect. Maybe that's one of the reasons why this case has gone unsolved for so long, but selecting the victims based on accessibility, not for any type of ulterior motive. And unreported attacks might have occurred. I think that's only fair to say, goes without saying, but included there anyway. Back to the profile created by John Douglas. With the caution that profiling deals in probabilities and generalities and not certainties, the FBI report suggests that Jack the Ripper was 28 to 36 years old. He was a man of average intelligence. He was very lucky but not clever. He was single, never married, had difficulty in interacting with people, in general with women, and in particular with women as well. He was nocturnal and not accountable to anyone, blended in with his surroundings, had poor personal hygiene and appeared disheveled, was personally inadequate with a low self-image and diminished emotional responses. He was a quiet loner, withdrawn and asocial, was of lower social class, lived and worked in Whitechapel, and committed crimes close to his homes. He had a menial job with little or no interaction with the public. He was employed Monday through Friday, possibly as a butcher, mortician's helper, medical examiner's assistant, or hospital attendant. The proximity of the London hospital was noted in the profile, and this was the product of a broken home. By this, I mean, we should say, he was the product of a broken home, lacked consistent care, and a stable adult model as a child. He was raised by a dominant female figure who drank heavily, consorted with different men, and physically and possibly sexually abused him. Jack the Ripper most likely set fires and abused animals as a child. He hated and feared and was intimidated by women, internalized his anger, and was mentally disturbed and sexually inadequate, with much generalized rage directed toward women, desired power, control, and dominance, behaved erratically, engaged in sexually motivated attacks to neuter his victims. And, I think there are a lot of very strong points here. Though this whole thing about, okay, well, he was a quiet loner, withdrawn from society, worked a menial job, didn't report to anyone, didn't have any accountability to anyone, those are some very old-fashioned things that people would say about serial killers. As we all know by now, that stuff just simply isn't true. I was just talking to you guys about Ted Bundy. He was somebody who was an extremely outgoing and articulate individual, and that's how he was able to put on these types of ruses. And then you have people like Joseph Paul Franklin, whom I just mentioned, the racist killer. Well, he was married for a very brief time when he was, as a teenager, like when he was around age 18 in the winter of 1969. So this whole concept of a serial killer is just going to be the sad, lonely man with no friends and doesn't report to anyone. I simply do not accept it. And I can't accept it because I mean, I just think that there's so many other possibilities. I've talked about so many people who go against this pattern, and I was just doing one on John Wayne Glover. By one, I mean, I made a short episode about John Wayne Glover here on Black Box Online Radio. He was an Australian serial killer who didn't commit his first murder until age 56. So I think that there are a lot of differences among serial killer behaviors, and I'm at the point now where I don't think that the patterns are extremely valuable. What I think this psychological profile is much more valuable for is talking about things such as age. We're talking about age 28 to 36. Yeah, absolutely. That might be hitting the nail on the head. And I think that there's a lot of consistent things to support that. In the last episode on Ripper Wednesday, I was talking to you guys about the witness sightings, and everybody's saying that they think that Jack the Ripper was around age 30, and then the George Hutchinson witness sighting says around age 36. Most likely. Now, this whole concept of being a poor, disheveled man, I mean, I don't think everybody agrees with that, and I'm not trying to act like I know more than John Douglas. I do not. But I was just reading the story, Yours truly, Jack the Ripper, and it's written by Robert Bloch, and I might do a larger segment about it here on Black Box Online Radio, and while it is fictional, it does share a real true crime theory, and that is saying everything to the contrary, that Jack the Ripper was somebody who was able to blend in with normal society, a working professional, and to some capacity, and he's able to put on the facade of being just a harmless professional, maybe working as some type of high-end profession, even like a doctor or something to that effect. And then he's committing the murders behind closed doors after dark, and he is just living a double life more so. So, I mean, not everybody is in complete agreement that Jack the Ripper would have been this low-level, nocturnal individual who was low-class and didn't have a lot of money and had zero friends. Now, all of the stuff about internalized anger, yes. Things about having an abusive mother who probably slept around, and that was an abusive experience for him emotionally, and then she abused him physically in some way. Yes, almost certainly. I think that those things would have happened, and that Jack the Ripper was someone who desired power, control, and dominance. Double yes, absolutely. I don't know how anyone would say anything to the contrary when he's just trying to dominate women and eviscerate their bodies. Now, Jack the Ripper engaged in sexually motivated attacks to neuter his victims, even though he's not sexually assaulting them. I also think that that's spot on. And let's continue with John Douglas's psychological profile here, because there are some other important ones. He thinks that Jack the Ripper would be drinking in local pubs prior to the murders, hunted nightly, and was observed walking all over Whitechapel during the early morning hours. He did not have medical knowledge or surgical expertise, was probably interviewed by the police at some point. He did not write any of the Jack the Ripper letters and would not have publicly challenged the police by taunting them with letters, and he did not commit suicide after the murder stopped. Now, I want to work backwards with this one. Did Jack the Ripper commit suicide after the murder of Mary Kelly on November 9th of 1888? I think that that is only relevant to people who have a certain suspect that they're trying to pin down. For example, with Montague John Druitt, he is perhaps the most famous suspect that gets pulled into this mix. He was the school teacher and barrister who committed suicide, let's see, roughly, that was at some time in December of 1888. We aren't exactly sure. Could have even been early November, and his body is found in the Thames. And he goes on to be a Jack the Ripper suspect. However, I've never liked this explanation, because with Montague John Druitt, it's mostly that he's just mentally unstable and out of control, yet he regains composure for at least 3 weeks and is just living his normal life, and nobody notices anything. That has never been sitting well with me. That's when the psychological profiles start to conflict. That sounds like what Robert Bloch was talking about in Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper, saying, well, yeah, Jack the Ripper acts like a professional during the daytime, and he commits the murders at night. Well, John Douglas is saying everything to the contrary. And my own personal take on the subject is, I don't think you'd be able to say that somebody had some type of deteriorating mental state from a neurological standpoint, and they would just be able to conceal it so well that they wouldn't be interrupted to the level that they're talking about with Montague John Druitt, that he lost complete control after the murder of Mary Kelly. He went absolutely insane and berserk, but he also kept things under control for at least 3 weeks. I'm hearing two different things at once. One is out of control, one is in control. And Jack the Ripper was probably interviewed by the police at some point. Quite normally. Quite normally that does happen. And what do sociopathic serial killers do? They talk their way out of it. They're very good liars. He did not write any of the Jack the Ripper letters. I've stated this in loads of other episodes here on Ripper Wednesday. I also agree with that. I don't think that the Ripper wrote any of the letters. But, what do you think about anything so far? And as I said, I do a segment about Jack the Ripper every Wednesday. I also do one about the Zodiac Killer every Monday called just that, Zodiac Monday. And on Fridays, I talk to you guys about T.B. Cooper. And tomorrow will be the 4th of July to all my American brothers and sisters out there. So I will be celebrating the 4th of July here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio. And if you want to follow along with all of these true crime discussions, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. You can also go through some of the links in the description box. One of them is for BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. And aside from that, though, I'm just going to be going through a lot more things from John Douglas here on this channel. I've always wanted to read more of his books because he really is one of the most famous psychological profilers that gets talked about in all of the true crime cases that I follow. The Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, D.B. Cooper. But what do you think about all of these statements here about how Jack the Ripper is some guy who was a white Caucasian male, intelligent but not overly intelligent, lucky, not clever, and that means that he wasn't somebody who was a genius, and he wasn't extremely cunning. He was just lucky not to have been caught. And I have a two-part response on this. One is that I don't think we know enough to say that Jack the Ripper was not a genius and he just got away with this all based on good luck. What I think is much more important from the psychological profile is that he had a very strong understanding of the streets of Whitechapel, a very strong understanding of the city of London. And that's how he was able to sneak around so easily. He knew about shortcuts, he knew about, like, holes in the wall, he knew about places to hide, and that type of intense familiarity made it very easy for him to get away. And here, somebody else brought up something about this issue of how Jack the Ripper would have had poor personal hygiene. Well, that would have been completely normal in Whitechapel, and a lot of the people, even the female victims, might have had some reasonably poor hygiene. So I think that that's something that's entirely possible. And here lived in or worked in Whitechapel and committed the crimes close to home. I pretty much just said that. I think that I completely agree with that. He was a butcher, mortician's helper, medical examiner's assistant, or hospital attendant. Now this means that, according to John Douglas and his psychological profile, he does not think that Jack the Ripper would have been a doctor, but maybe he worked in a hospital. And this relates to two suspects that I've talked about, really three, because when I told you guys about the top four suspects that I laid out, I said Aaron Kosminski, Charles Lechmere, Jacob Levy, and Joseph Barnett. Francis Thompson was in the top level, and I moved him down a little bit. But, he's also relevant to this actually as well, because he wasn't a medical examiner's assistant. He was a quality control inspector for medical instruments. So yeah, he would be relevant to this as well. But Jacob Levy was a butcher who did indeed work in Whitechapel. He had syphilis, which was most likely neurosyphilis, and, somebody who would have had the capabilities to use a knife and different blades, but also not someone who was overly intelligent. I mean, I don't know what his IQ was or anything, but, he had neurosyphilis and it was destroying his brain, although I don't think it was extremely rapid, because the Ripper is showing a fair amount of awareness with his choices. Mortician's helper, entirely possible, but that's anybody's guess. And medical examiner's assistant or hospital attendant, also as well. That's something that we do encounter from time to time in serial killer mysteries and so on. But what do you think about the psychological profile that has been created by John Douglas? You can put your ideas in the comment section down below. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there is always BlackBoxNet88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.